speaker today is Michael Ober. Michael is the director of the library at Flathead Valley Community College. He holds undergraduate and graduate degrees in history from the University of Montana, and for the past 23 years has worked as a ranger at Glacier Park, 12 of those years at the Lake MacDonald Ranger Station. This experience has given him the opportunity to get to know quite well the people that I guess Glacierites call inholders, those people who still own private cabins within the boundaries of Glacier Park, and also for him to explore the history of those properties and those families. So today, Michael is going to talk about two of the early innkeepers at Lake MacDonald.
All right, thank you, and good morning to you all. Welcome. It is a picture in contrasting personalities, business styles, and lifestyles that I want to present to you today. And we will get in right away to my slides, and we will begin our discussion of Frank Kelly and John Lewis, two individuals who I suspect are not very well known out of this region. And that's fine, because I think if we remember the words of Emerson, who reminded us that there is properly no history, only biography, then it's necessary and appropriate to delve into the lives of some people who are well known, like Charlie Russell, and some who are less well known, such as John Lewis, and even to a lesser extent, Frank Kelly. We can get some lights out. I want to launch right into an overview of Lake MacDonald and the personalities and properties there, and specifically these two individuals.
Why don't you go, can you flip it to power on there? Great, thanks.
There we go. As you look at the lake, setting for our discussion, it's necessary to know that this is a region untouched by many people before the 1890s. And it is a place where folks came to, as Liz indicated, relax and recreate, and that is essentially what drew our two individuals to this area. As you look at Mr. Lewis, John Ellsworth Lewis, and this is a much later photograph of him. He does not have his long dark hair and his dark mustache. It's a grainy picture taken from a newspaper. This picture was taken just before his death in 1934. He is the more prominent of our shared individuals. Much more well known, with great stature through northwest Montana, and we will get to him in a moment. But it is the fellow that I want to begin with, the rugged individual Frank Kelly, who we want to discuss a little bit about early on. Mr. Kelly was born in Dubuque, Iowa, a flatlander, if you will, 1855. He grew up on a farm, and he received only about a 7th grade education, as nearly as I can tell. And at age 19, he left home. He had a large family, and was essentially kicked out of that family. Very little to eat, very little to do in Iowa. He traveled north to the woods of Minnesota and took a job as a bull cook in a lumbering camp. It is there that he fashioned some lasting and enjoyable associations with things which would pay him off later handsomely: wood and water. He spent some time rafting logs down the northern Mississippi and worked for some time there in some logging camps. He came west to Astoria, Oregon later on, where he remarked that it rained too much. He worked back and forth between logging camps in Oregon and Northern California, and last went back to Astoria, where he remarked it was still raining too much. Went down to San Francisco and took passage on a sailing vessel loaded with lumber. Sailed around Cape Horn to Le Havre, France, then to Paris, then to London, and then to New York, and back to Wisconsin. And he first shows up in Montana in the year 1883. He was employed by the Northern Pacific Railroad and lived in Livingston for a while, putting out logs and ties for the railroad. He then went back to the east and decided that this was the place he wanted to be. And for a period of 20 years, after some wandering, he came to the valley that he would ultimately settle in. And as you look at this early day map, a much exaggerated map, which shows if you will, a little bit larger than life MacDonald Lake up here near the town of Belton, which you see an early day photo of here. This is the place he came to land, and after all, his wanderings were all done, and this is the place that he determined that he would settle in. He would have crossed the middle fork of the Flathead River and worked his way down through the rough road that was being hacked out by the settlers at that area and come to Apgar, the little village of Apgar at the foot of the lake. It is from there that the view that he saw inspired him, as others, and it captivated him enough to where he determined that he would make a homestead there. He hooked up with another gentleman who was employed by the Great Northern also, a fellow named Denny Como, and together they fashioned a log dugout out of a black cottonwood tree and paddled around this lake. At the head of the lake, where you're looking right now, they selected their home sites and their homesteads. On the right-hand side, Denny Como selected a spot near Snyder Creek, and on the left-hand side, Kelly selected his homestead near what ultimately would be called locally Kelly Creek. It, as the Daily Interlake described, the site, quote, gave Kelly some wonderful timber, a nice little bay, and a good stream of ice-cold water, which there entered the lake. The year was 1892. Kelly was single, 37 years old, and so began Kelly's camp. A man accustomed to working with wood, he owned and operated his own little portable sawmill. He began immediately to erect a cabin for himself, and he also built cabins for others around the lake, and some other guest cabins, which he determined to rent out to some of the visitors who began then coming to this area. A lot of attention was being drawn to to this area, which will soon become Glacier Park, by the Great Northern, and it was to those rail-borne visitors that Kelly determined to give some accommodations. Kelly, I guess, and Lewis, I guess, can be given credit for establishing the real genesis of visitor accommodations in this area. The real earliest of tourist resorts, of log resorts, of overnight accommodations for those guests pictured here came from Lewis and Kelly. I guess when you put together somebody's life and you begin to assemble the pieces of their past, it's interesting for us historians to try to find that one little piece of evidence that would make them unique, right? That would make that person stand out from all the others. And try, though I might, to distort the historical picture, there's not much can be said about Frank Kelly that is really unique, really outstanding. A couple of examples. It would be nice to say that Kelly owned and operated the first steam-powered vessel on Lake MacDonald. It's not true. George Snyder owned that boat. It would be nice to say that Frank Kelly really was the guy that located Sperry Glacier. It's not true either. Although it is clear that Kelly and others around the Lake MacDonald area did know of the existence of that glacier and others. But it is to Lyman B. Sperry, pictured here in the middle of your picture, that credit goes. Sperry was in the employ of the Great Northern Railroad and was sent out here to find interesting attractions for visitors, for all those rail-borne visitors, for Hill's Line. Typically, I guess, Sperry took the credit, and Frank Kelly, who was a guide frequently with the Sperry entourage, had little credit to receive. He is a man shown in this picture, right here, always in the background, a humble man, not very well educated, didn't write very much, read even less. He took little credit for it, while Sperry got all the credit for finding and locating some of the geological features around that area. This did not settle very well with the local papers, and I want to read you what the editor of the Interlake thought about that. To the people of Kalispell, Dr. Sperry was a typical Eastern tenderfoot who came in a Pullman, a dapper little man dressed in a cutaway coat, knickerbockers tucked into polished riding boots, a perky fedora, a stiff white collar, an ascot tie, who explored the wilds under the guidance of frontiersmen like Gadoon, Kelly, Como, Christensen, and others who were already familiar with them. His explorations were a joke, and his discoveries absurdly ridiculous. The editor of this Interlake and the general public keenly resents his wholesale giving of place names and considered him an interloper. Nonetheless, he got the credit. Kelly, in 1897, withdrew from the guiding business, which he said he had little stomach for, and devoted his attentions to the establishment of his little cabin camp. 1897 is also, as you will recall, the year that this area was designated as a National Forest Reserve, and therefore all homesteading ceased at that point. 1897 is also the year that he married his wife Emmeline, a woman 23 years younger than he. Together they set about to establishing and improving upon Kelly's camp. Some of the homes you see here were all built by Emmeline and Mr. Kelly. The log work was handsome. Kelly, in one picture you will see here soon, had some of the largest hands I've seen in a picture of a man. That's typical in people who work with logs most of their life. A gentleman named Austin Weichert, who built many cabins in Glacier National Park, also had some extremely large hands. And this is some of his handiwork. He built later on in years, when he owned Kelly's camp, his own little micro hydropower generating plant working off of Kelly's Creek. And since they lived there year-round, they had their own store of supplies and a little root cellar. One of Kelly's great loves was for boats. And it is certain that on boats like this and others, this is his first boat, the Emmeline, named for his wife, that individuals like Charlie Russell rode up and down the lake, because as you know, there was no road along the lake at that time in the early days. And the only way you could get up and down to Kelly's camp from Apgar or to Lewis's hotel across the lake was by boat. This boat is pictured on the landing skids right in front of Kelly's camp. And I do recall as a child when I would grow up and spend summers at Kelly's camp, the skids are still there. And in the bottom of the lake are still handfuls of nails from where that vessel was burned after long years of lack of use. The nails are still there, the skids are still there, and the skids still show some scorch marks from when it was burned in low water times. But his love was for boats, and that's what he became known for. Now, whether they knew it or not, Frank Kelly and John Lewis were on converging historical paths. Consider this, they were both, ironically enough, born in Iowa, a couple of flatlanders who came to the mountainous area here. They were born 10 years apart, and in 1865, John Ellsworth Lewis came to the earth, and he was born, ironically enough, less than 100 miles from where Frank Kelly was born. That's where the similarities end, because while Frank Kelly went off to work in the woods, John Lewis elected to go to college, and he played baseball and football at the University of Iowa for 3 years. He ultimately received a law degree from the University of Iowa. And in the year 1889, he came out to the new state of Montana as a catcher on a professional baseball team in Helena, where he received the untold sum of $2,500 for playing baseball, professional baseball here in our new state. That lasted a year. But it was while he was in Helena, Liz, that he had his first encounter with Charlie Russell. And Charlie Russell shared with him some interesting anecdotes about the Indians of northwest Montana, painted for him some pictures, and got him started and interested in the collecting of Indian memorabilia, something which he would do for the rest of his life. In fact, upon his death, his sister, Lewis's sister, donated his entire collection of Indian artifacts to the University of Montana. Included there were some original Russell pieces of art. These are things which John Lewis, a contemporary of Russell, collected and gathered all through his life, because they certainly did know each other. They spent a lot of enjoyable times with each other here on Lake MacDonald. In 1890, Lewis came to the Flathead Valley. Even though he had a law degree, he determined not to practice that. He took instead a job with Ramsdale's General Store in the town of Damarsville. At this time, the Upper Flathead was an active area in fur trading, and it was that job that he held for many years. actively engaged in a fur trading activity with the Indians all the way from Fort Steele in Canada down to the Bitterroot Valley. He traveled extensively. Doubtless he knew and got associated with most of the tribes in the Northwest. Lewis is probably best known, although he was a hotel keeper, for his activities as a fur trader. He was at one time the largest private marketer of raw furs in the Pacific Northwest. That's why, in some part, when you go to Lake MacDonald Lodge, the hotel that he ultimately built, a lot of the furs that you see there are from his collection. And he had, in fact, a furrier store and a furrier room in that hotel. So, safe to say that Lewis built his initial fortune in that kind of a business, and it was a position that he would hold and an activity that he would engage in for over 40 years. But for our portion of the discussion, Lewis and his wife Olive, they had no children incidentally, are best known for their activities in hotels and innkeeping. Lewis was no dummy, of course, and he recognized early on that the attention being drawn to this area by the Great Northern and others, and Grinnell, for example, would ultimately lead to national park status. Lewis was a staunch Republican and became associated with that party and the Theodore Roosevelt family early on. Because of those connections, he was the receiver, appointed receiver of public monies. In that capacity, he came to know of and acquired large tracts of land throughout northwest Montana, in the area that was to become Glacier Park, and also down in the Columbia Falls area where he owned the Gaylord Hotel, remodeled it with another gentleman, and made it one of the finest innkeeping facilities on the Great Northern's High Line. He also owned the Columbia Hotel, and he owned large tracts of land within the Columbia Falls town site. He bought for $8,500 420 acres of lakeshore property on Lake MacDonald. Included in that was the old Snyder Hotel, shown here. And he began to improve upon that property. This property, of course, was located directly across the lake from Kelly's cabin camp. So in some ways, you see, both these individuals became competing, if you will, businessmen, but somehow they did establish and maintain and sustain a sort of a business-like symbiosis in which they worked closely with each other. But it is not clear to me whether either individual was very well acquainted with each other, although being on the lake, they must have had to have been. But because of their differing social backgrounds, the record does not indicate that they were all that close as individuals. Certainly they operated their businesses in a business-like manner, and one did ultimately overshadow the other. But still they managed to sustain and maintain the kind of activities which gave rise to the earliest of innkeeping facilities in this area. Lewis, I guess, is best known for his hotel, the Lewis's Hotel, or Lewis's Glacier Hotel. It was in the year 1913 that he assembled an army of workers, and with some plans in hand, which a Cutter and Malgrim architectural firm had drawn up for him. Cutter and Malgrim designed the Davenport Hotel in Spokane, and they were given, incidentally, free rein as to cost in the construction and design of this structure. Lewis directed them to spare no cost because he said, I want something which will rival those hotels currently being constructed by the Great Northern. And in that respect, I think he succeeded. Lewis's Hotel, shown here at its completion in 1914, was and is still, I think, a central focus site for visitors and guests to the MacDonald Valley. When it opened in that summer, there was a gala extravaganza for opening. Special fares were designated for people to come from Kalispell on the Great Northern Rail Line. Again, you couldn't get there except on boat. You had to go to Apgar and then take a boat up to the head of the lake. There was a week-long celebration of fireworks each evening, roping and packing contests by local guides, high diving events, foot races, a gala ball, a brass band, etc. At this time, of course, Lewis was very well known throughout the area. and a lot of his guests and friends were from this area and from elsewhere. Let me read you what the Interlake indicated about this particular hotel. It says, the acme of beauty and design. It was the last word in personality. Here he enjoyed the friendship of the nation's great who came there to vacation. Here Charlie Russell, Irvin S. Cobb, and Mary Roberts Reinhardt, and others of the nation's celebrities came every year to sense the frontier personality of John E. Lewis. Charlie Russell painted gift pictures for Mr. Lewis, smoked Bull Durham, sat atop the corral fence, and talked to the kids. The cowboy artist would occasionally dress up to satisfy conventioners, but he always felt uneasy. He never forgot his old friends who appreciated informality as well as he did. Here he often said that he was getting a hell of a price for them pictures. He gave them away to his good friends, like Lewis. Well, meanwhile, what about Kelly across the lake, a mere 1.5 miles away? Instead of crumbling under competition, he stubbornly clung to his little humble resort, his little string of cabins, and in some ways prospered because of the Lewis Hotel. Without his boats, he would not have done as well, not have been as successful, and neither would Lewis have, because Lewis said, without Kelly's sturdy flotilla of boats, I would have been obliged to provide my own transportation. So again, the symbiosis kicks in, and as you look at the boat, one of the boats named for one of his nieces, Ethel, you can see Kelly and Emmeline there. You can understand why both of these people seem to survive and, in fact, thrive at the head of Lake MacDonald. There, of course, being no Coast Guard boarding regulations or OSHA regulations, this was de rigueur. Kelly also owned and operated the first gasoline-powered launch on Lake MacDonald. That was the Janet shown here. You can see the exhaust port on the starboard side here. This is right in front of Lewis's Glacier Hotel. As it all came to an end, as things do, some of the similarities and some of the differences in Lewis and Kelly's lives came to the fore. All four of our individuals, Kelly and Lewis and their wives, all died within 10 months of each other. Lewis's wife, Olive, died in the spring of 1934, and because of some heart complications, Lewis died later on in December of that year. He was in a hospital in Portland, well cared for, as a gentleman of his stature should have been. When he was returned to the Flathead Valley, his funeral was one of the most grandiose that Kalispell had ever seen. It took place at the Liberty Hotel, or the Liberty Theater, and Frank Bird Linderman delivered the funeral address. Lewis was very prominent in the Masons, so full Masonic rites were in order. The funeral procession strung for over 1 mile, going up to Conrad Memorial Cemetery, where he was laid to rest next to his wife Olive. No fewer than 92 honorary pallbearers are listed in his obituary. By contrast, 3 weeks after Lewis died, both Emmeline and John Kelly suffered from pneumonia and died in their cabin at Lake MacDonald. In a severe bout of weather in which the temperature was 30 degrees below zero and none of their friends could get at them, they passed away quietly and humbly, suitably, I think. And their friends had to go to their cabin and bring them across the frozen waters of Lake MacDonald on a sled. The waters on which they had spent so many enjoyable times and so many hours traveling up and down the lake in Lewis's quaint little boats. He's shown here on the left next to his one of his portable sawmills, and I do recall even seeing that sawmill, and it may very well be under some of these cabins, which are still there, incidentally. And that's, I think, what's interesting about this whole scenario, is that the structures which these gentlemen built are still there, are still available to see, much like Bullhead Lodge is. And that's what brings together the conclusion to this kind of a historical picture. Although they are gone, their structures still remain. And so, when the end did come for Mr. Lewis and Mr. Kelly, it was interesting that Kelly and his wife Emmeline had a very simple funeral, attended by a few of their friends, and they too were laid to rest in the Conrad Memorial Cemetery. So it came to pass that the two lakeshore innkeepers, sort of the prince and pauper of Lake MacDonald, came to rest in the same area, both from Iowa, but both ending up in the same place. Their burial sites, like their business sites, with an easy view of one another. You've been a good bunch, and I appreciate it. I hope you've learned something about the two people who spent some time here, and also about one of the more prominent ones, Charlie Russell. I'll turn this back over to Mary. If we have any questions, we can entertain those. Thank you very much.
I think we'll have some light.
Our speaker tonight is J. Anthony Lucas. Tony Lucas was educated at Harvard and the Free University in Berlin, Germany. He contributes to magazines ranging from the Atlantic and Harper's to the Washington Post, Book World, and Playboy. He's winner of 2 Pulitzer Prizes, the first awarded him in 1968 for special local reporting in connection with his coverage of the Chicago 7 conspiracy trial for the New York Times, which later became a book entitled The Barnyard Epithet and Other Obscenities, Notes on the Chicago Conspiracy Trial. His second Pulitzer Prize came in 1986 for general nonfiction for his book on Boston busing, Common Ground, A Turbulent Decade in the Lives of 3 American Families. He also is author of The Underside of the Nixon Years, which produced quite a book, as you might imagine. Tony lives in New York City, but he comes most recently from Helena, where he has been researching on various things, including the socialist newspaper woman Ida Crouch Hazlitt. His book that he's working on now is on the Big Bill Haywood trial, which grew up generally out of the labor strife in the Coeur d'Alene district of Idaho at the turn of the century, and specifically out of the assassination of former Idaho Governor Frank Steunenberg. I picked Tony up at the airport this afternoon, and I asked why a man with 2 Pulitzer Prizes for work on the Chicago 7 trial and Boston busing would take on a topic like the Big Bill Haywood trial and Western labor strife in the Rocky Mountain West. Tony said he became interested in the topic about 2 years ago, and he said he was looking for a story with gumshoe detectives, unethical newspapermen, vamps, assorted, and other assorted sleazy characters. I thought to myself, well, I'm glad he found it in Idaho. Certainly there was never anything like that similar in Montana. Fortunately, Tony's plane came in about 3 or 3:30. He didn't get here till 4, well past the session on Montana's jerks. Without further ado, I present to you a Pulitzer Prize-winning author, a fine historian and journalist, and a very likable man, Tony Lucas.
Thank you, Chuck. No dinner speech is complete without an opening anecdote, and it was provided for me on my plane trip from Salt Lake City to Helena. I don't know whether you've ever heard an entire 747 jet erupt in laughter, but I did when the embarrassed young stewardess said that she wanted to welcome 210 people on their flight to Helena. The woman next to me said, "Can you believe it?" I had a feeling that Delta had lost several clients, but I have learned my pronunciation, and I've had a splendid time for 2 days in your remarkable library at Helena, and I'm delighted to be here tonight. Some of you may know a passage from Ross Lockridge's novel Raintree County, in which John Wycliffe Shaughnessy and Professor Jerusalem Webster Stiles are reading through a copy of the Indianapolis News Historian for July 4th, 1892, in which is recounted the most recent pontification of Garwood P. Jones, the senior senator from Indiana, about the forces of anarchy abroad in the land. "Meanwhile," Mr. Shaughnessy said, "the real world goes on, the world of the only possible fact." "What is this fact?" asked the professor. "A human life," said Shaughnessy. "That's the only thing that ever happens, whereas the news historian, like history, deals with something called the event." "What is this event?" the professor asked cooperatively. "The event is something that never happened," Shaughnessy went on. "It's a convenient myth abstracted from the welter of human fact. Events happen only in the newspapers and history books. But life goes on, being one human being at a time who is trying to find that mythical republic in which he can live with honor and happiness." "Just so," the professor said, "and thus the republic's a lie, and history's a lie, and the newspaper's a great lie." Well, in this company of so many distinguished historians, I would not go quite that far. But I would argue that, as Shaughnessy and the professor have hinted, history and journalism have similar perplexing and largely unsolved problems in making their selection from the welter of human fact. But fact is not enough, I think. I'm reminded of an incident which took place during the Chicago conspiracy trial, aforementioned, which I covered for the New York Times in 1969-70. Among the witnesses summoned by the defense was one Norman Mailer. From the start of his testimony, it was clear that Mailer came back to Chicago that day to exorcise a nagging sense of guilt about his own role during the convention in Chicago. On the bandstand in Grant Park on the day of the celebrated police riot, he had told the crowd that he couldn't take part in their demonstration because he had a magazine deadline to meet and couldn't risk getting arrested. The radicals didn't buy that, and some even suggested that the champ was frightened. Ever sensitive about slights to his manhood, Mailer had brooded about the charge ever since, and on the witness stand, he tried to grapple honestly with his own emotions. "I was in a moral quandary," he said. "I didn't know if I was being scared or being professional. And I was naturally quite upset because a man never likes to know that his motive might be simple fear." But Judge Julius Hoffman was impatient with all this motivational probing. "We're simple folks here," he snapped. "Just tell us what you said." And he said. Finally, as Mailer continued to search out the delicate shadings of meaning in the streets of Chicago, Assistant U.S. Attorney Dick Schultz leapt to his feet and told him to stick to the facts. Mailer fixed the young lawyer with a dyspeptic eye and said, "Facts are nothing without their nuance, sir." That line stuck in my head, and a few years later, when I left the Times to write books for a living, I had decided that the principal reason was there just wasn't much space for nuance in a daily newspaper. That isn't really the newspaper's fault. Most of daily journalism is produced at breakneck speed for rather small news holes, with the emphasis on communicating the maximum information in brief compass. When the copy editor's red pencil begins to flash, the first things to go are the reporter's stabs at nuance. And one shouldn't blame the editors too much. One must concede that most reporters aren't terribly good at the nuance game themselves. During my term as the Times correspondent in India, I covered a burst of Hindu fundamentalist agitation over the cow slaughter issue. As you will recall, Hindus regard the cow as a protected creature. If not quite sacred, then certainly an animal imbued with special grace and power. It goes without saying that to eat beef is a terrible crime against the faith. Muslims don't see it that way, and occasionally violence will break out in a North Indian province when Muslims slaughter a cow. In the spring of 1966, nearly a dozen Muslims were killed in Uttar Pradesh over the cow slaughter issue. As an old customer at Frankie and Johnny's renowned speakeasy and steakhouse on 46th Street, it was difficult for me to empathize with the Hindus on this one. I tried. I wrote 6 stories about the cow slaughter issue, struggling to understand why Hindus were willing to take human life in order to protect bovine life. Try as I might, I couldn't quite understand. And late one night, as I pounded out a piece for the News of the Week in Review, I thought to myself, after 5 years in the Congo and India, I'm ready to go home, where I can capture the cadence of the people I'm writing about, not just the facts. It was the search for cadence, the search for nuance, which led to my departure from the New York Times in 1973. For the past 17 years, I've been a freelance journalist writing articles and books. A big chunk of that time was spent on my last book, Common Ground, in which I sought to capture the cadences of 3 different families, one Irish, one black, and one Yankee, as they collided over issues of race and class in Boston. The effort to cross the boundaries of race and class, to understand what it must have been like growing up in somebody else's shoes, is, I think, one of the writer's principal tasks. The novelist Ed Doctorow has said that one thing the writer does is to distribute the sorrow. That is to say, by making us feel the sorrow of those he writes about, he or she writes about, to allow us to pick up at least part of the sorrow borne by one's characters. Doctorow is clearly talking about the novelist more than the writer of nonfiction, but I like that notion of distributing the sorrow, and I think, without realizing it, was one of the things I was trying to do in Common Ground. But race and class and geography are not the only gulfs which divide us. L.P. Hartley, the British novelist, has said, "The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there." If it was difficult for me to comprehend the Hindus' rage at cow slaughter, it is difficult for any of us to comprehend life as it was led 50 years ago, much less 100 or 200 years ago. In Common Ground, I began to gnaw at that boundary by tracing each of the 3 families back to the 18th century. Indeed, I became obsessed by the historical roots of the Boston tragedy because I was convinced that we all trail around with us 3 strands of history: our personal history, our family history, and what, for lack of a better name, I would call our tribal history. To me, much of Common Ground was about the burden of history. One needn't subscribe to predestination to believe that we are all nudged along by these 3 strands of history. Not surprisingly, then, when the time came to choose the subject for my next book, I decided to attempt for the first time a full-blown work of history. The subject I chose, as Chuck has mentioned, are the events surrounding the assassination of the one-time governor of Idaho, Frank Steunenberg, in 1905. Back where I come from in the East, there would be at this point a collective shrug of incomprehension in the room. Virtually nobody, and this may interest you, virtually nobody I have told about this story east of the Mississippi has ever heard of it. But I assume that out here the Steunenberg saga still has a certain resonance. For the few among you who may not know it, let me just briefly summarize it for you. In late December of 1905, the former governor of Idaho, Frank Steunenberg, returns from an errand downtown in the little town of Caldwell Idaho, 30 miles south of Boise, and enters his garden gate, at which point a bomb attached to the gate blows him, as the paper the next day said, into eternity. The local authorities immediately throw a cordon around the town and arrest the usual suspects, 7 of the weirdest weirdos you can possibly imagine. And they finally charge one Thomas Hogan, an itinerant sheep dealer, with murdering the governor. At this point enters James McParland, the legendary Pinkerton detective who 30 years before had been responsible for infiltrating the Molly Maguires in the Pennsylvania coalfields, and I think leading to the execution of 12 of them. Execution of 12 of them. McParland becomes the principal investigator of the Steunenberg assassination, and about 6 weeks later, extracts from Thomas Hogan one of the most astonishing confessions in American criminal history. That A, he is not Thomas Hogan, he is Harry Orchard, and B, that he has blown up the governor, and C, that he, you think that's something, he has blown up or otherwise assassinated 26 other people, all at the behest of the single man who James McParland has been targeting for the last decade, namely Big Bill Haywood, the Secretary of the Western Federation of Miners. And this leads ultimately to the trial of Haywood in Boise in the summer of 1907, and what was widely called the trial of the century. The century was only 7 years old by that point. I covered it. When I walked into the office of Judge Julius Hoffman in Chicago in 1970, the first words out of Julius Hoffman's mouth were, "Tell me, Mr. Lucas, do you think this will be the trial of the century?" It seems to be on journalist and judge's mind. Anyway, that's the story. Your own state of Montana plays a curious role in the drama, in this drama. As you know, the Coeur d'Alene region of northern Idaho got to introduce Coeur d'Alene. If Big Bill Haywood was responsible for the assassination of Governor Steunenberg, it was, and this was indeed the theory behind the prosecution, it was because Steunenberg was, because the Western Federation was determined to revenge the events of 1899 in the Coeur d'Alene district of northern Idaho, where the governor had called on federal troops. He couldn't call on the National Guard because they were off fighting the Spanish-American War in the Philippines. So he called on federal troops, turned out to be black troops, the famed 24th Infantry Regiment, and these troops had put down, with rather vigorously, a labor insurrection in the Coeur d'Alene. So, Montana, as you know, has an interesting relationship to the Coeur d'Alene district of northern Idaho, which backs up to Montana's western boundary. A curious kind of symbiosis has developed across that mountainous border. On the one hand, the Western Federation of Miners drew much of its early impetus from Montana, most particularly from Butte, whose vigorous unionists for a long while provided the elan, the organizing experience, and indeed the funding for their colleagues across the border. But these very same Idaho miners also used Montana as a kind of exile land, a northern Elba, for men who they saw as traitors to their calling. In April 1892, 4 non-union men, among them William Pipkin and George Wolfe, were hired as strikebreakers by the Spokane mine magnate A.B. Campbell for his union mine in Burke, a tiny, heavily unionized, heavily Irish mining camp in the famed canyon above Wallace. After a few hours in the mine, the 4 men were dragged before a union meeting in Burke. According to Pipkin, who testified later before an investigating committee, the chairman said, "This meeting has been called for the purpose of ascertaining what these men have come into the country for. They are not representatives of the union, and they have no right to come in and go to work." Pipkin replied, I'm a free American citizen, and I thought I had a right to work for whom I pleased, and when I pleased, and where I pleased, if my employer and myself could agree. The chairman asked all 4 men whether they were now ready to join the Union. The 2 others said they were, but Pipkin and Wolfe staunchly refused. The 200 miners then voted on whether to send them down the canyon to Wallace, a relatively short jaunt downhill, or up the canyon and over the mountains into Montana. An arduous 30-mile hike across the snowfields and rocks, all the more forbidding that day because a storm was approaching. The vote was 220-1 to send them up the canyon. When they asked for food before they set out, again according to William Pipkin, Union men said, "No, you," excuse the language, folks, "no, you damn sons of bitches, you go to Montana and you go without anything to eat," adding, "You want to go right on into Montana. If you go back to the Coeur d'Alene, your lives aren't worth a cent." As they began tramping up the canyon, youngsters followed along, banging on coal oil cans which they had hung around their necks with ropes as one would a snare drum, and shouting, again, excuse the language, "You sons of bitches, you whorehouse pimps." Finally, the boys dropped away. Pipkin and Wolfe slogged on. The snow was 2 feet deep, but in places drifted up to 6 to 10 feet. In places they fell through up to their hips. It began to rain, laying a slick of ice across the powdery snow. Dressed just as they'd come out of the mine with no coats or hats, the men were chilled to the bone. Starting at 3 p.m., they reached the summit just after dark. At the halfway house in the divide, they were refused food with the warning, "Men who haven't any better sense than to kick against the miners' union ought not to have anything to eat." Mind you, this tale is all Pipkin's tale, as yet uncorroborated by vigorous journalism. Later, a prospector gave them a biscuit as big as an egg and a little piece of bacon. That was all they had to eat until they reached Thompson Falls, Montana, after nightfall the next day. From there, they went to Boise, where a judge issued injunctions against the Union miners in Burke, prohibiting them from interfering with any men at work in the mines. Many miners were arrested for violating the injunction. Indeed, there is a strong suspicion that A.B. Campbell had sent Pipkin and Wolfe into the Union mine precisely to provoke such an incident and get that injunction. After all, when you think about it, how much ore could 4 non-union men extract from a struck mine? But they could extract a judicial edict, which soon became an important weapon in the mine owners' hands. 7 years later, after the 1899 explosion at the Bunker Hill Mill, Montana played a very different role, serving as a refuge for some of the very same miners who had led the strike against the Burke mine in 1892. According to military reports, several dozen of the most prominent Union leaders fled across those same Cabinet Mountains into Montana in the hours and days after the explosion of the Bunker Hill mine, which was indeed the precipitating event of all of the events in 1899, which ultimately, as I say, led to, according to the prosecution's theory, to Steunenberg's assassination. General Henry Clay Merriam was appointed by President McKinley to lead the military expedition of the Coeur d'Alene, and he ordered Lieutenant Henry G. Lyon of Company D, the 24th Infantry, with 65 enlisted men, the very black troops, by the way, who had gone up San Juan Hill next to the Rough Riders, to Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders, and if I read the history correctly, were the true heroes of San Juan Hill, but that's another story. Company D was ordered to cross into Montana at the aforementioned Thompson Falls. Lyon was accompanied by 3 Idaho sheriff's deputies. Lyon later insisted that his detachment was never intended to make any arrests or assist in making arrests. The arrests, he said, were to be made strictly by Montana deputies, who would then turn the fugitives over to the Idaho deputies. Lyon later told Congress that his troops were merely there for what he called their moral effect on the people of Montana. His unit's official status, he testified, was, quote, "United States troops in the field changing stations," unquote. Under close questioning by the Democrats on the investigating committee, Lyon conceded that his troops accompanied the deputies both on the train and later in Montana, that they were there to support the deputies, and that had there been resistance from the prisoners, they might well have intervened. In fact, the troops played a much larger role than intended, in part because Montana authorities declined to play their anticipated roles. The most flagrant example of this was in Missoula, where the city and county deputies refused to participate in a scheduled raid on a boarding house where suspected fugitives from Idaho were said to be living. At the request of the Idaho deputies, Lyon, 3 non-commissioned officers, and 10 privates went along on this raid. Lyon insisted that they were there purely as spectators, but it appears that by then Lyon was champing at the bit, determined to get the job done at all costs. His telegram to General Merriam on May 9th betrays his mounting irritation. Quote, "Reliable information leads me to believe that there are at least 25 fugitives in hiding here. Secret raid executed at 2 this morning was frustrated by indifference or treachery of local officers. Sheriff has made no arrests and is out of town. Deputy Sheriff Violette flatly declined to make arrests but consented to accompany party. City Marshal Angevine wavered toward the last and declined to make arrests but consented to accompany the party. Mayor Webster advised Angevine not to make arrests or permit his men under circumstances. Local policemen declined to make an arrest when requested by my surgeon. U.S. Commissioner Smith seems a negative character. An effort is being made to release prisoners I hold on writ of habeas corpus," unquote. Obviously, it was time to get out. But could he really take with him the 10 men he held? Again, it seems that there was hesitation among Montana officials. But under heavy pressure from Idaho and federal authorities, Governor Robert Smith of Montana finally cabled Lyon on May 10th. The state of Montana will not interpose any objection to removing prisoners to Idaho without requisition papers. This is your authority. And on May 10th, Lyon and the 24th Infantry crossed over to Idaho with their 10 minor prisoners. For months, the debate over the Montana raid raged on. After extensive hearings by the House Committee on Military Affairs, the Republican majority endorsed this and other features of General Merriam's operation. But the Democratic minority thundered at Merriam's, quote, arbitrary, despotic, and tyrannical, unquote, behavior, with the Montana raid a central part of the indictment. Merriam, the Democrats charged, was guilty of a gross violation of law by sending Lyon and his troops into Montana. It cannot be contended for a moment, their report said, that General Merriam had any authority for this action. Honest men and women may differ on these facts. My own impression is that General Merriam and his subordinates were rough-hewn military men who had not thought through the implications of their action, stumbling along on an ad hoc basis, often under the burden of conflicting and politically motivated instructions from Washington. They often violated the rights of private citizens. On the basis of the evidence contained in War Department telegrams, the Montana raid appears to have been such an occasion. But it is in just such a matter that it is well to be suspicious of mere facts and to invoke Norman Mailer's shrewd admonition that they are nothing without their nuance, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tony.